Dan Donner, let me start with you. In your report, The World's Energy Outlook, you're reporting that there are dramatic changes happening. Please give me key changes that will be happening over the next decade or so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing we all need to bear in mind is that the global energy system is hugely complex, and it's constructed of many interconnected moving parts. And in our global energy system today, two particular trends are really important with regards to the global reorientation that we see going on and the shift in the global energy landscape. Now, the first of these is one that we've known about for some time, and it's driven by the phenomenal economic growth in many emerging markets over the last decade or so. Now, going hand in hand with this rapid economic growth has been an explosion in the amount of energy that these countries consume, and much of this has been coal. And for example, in 2000, China consumed less than half as much energy as the US. It's now already overtaken it as the number one energy consumer in the world, and it will extend this lead in the years ahead. Quite simply, the center of gravity in the energy world has shifted towards Asia and emerging markets more generally. Now, the second one is a much more recent phenomenon and is still evolving, and this is the resurgence in oil and gas production in the United States, where a combination of technological innovation and supportive prices is unlocking unconventional resources there that had long been considered too difficult or too expensive to exploit. Now, in the U.S. conventional oil output, this had long been in decline. But in the future, we see that this will be more than compensated for by a surge in unconventional oil production there. And this turnaround has been so dramatic that it means that by the end of this decade, the United States, in our projections, becomes the largest global producer of both oil and gas, a development that was all but unthinkable just a few years ago. But it is an important caveat to say that actually, while the U.S. becomes the largest producer of oil, Saudi Arabia will continue to play an important role as the world's largest oil exporter. Now, if you bring these two trends together, what you see, one of the most striking examples of this, is that actually, when we look ahead to 2035, which in energy terms is not that far away, fully 90% of Middle East oil exports will head eastwards to markets in Asia rather than to their more traditional markets of the US and Europe. I mean, quite simply, this will completely change the focus of the Middle East customer relationship and potentially prompt a big shift in the geopolitics of energy.
And I suppose, an ordinary South African will say, all of this happening, but how will it affect my life? How will it affect the price that I pay for gas?
I mean, looking at gas markets specifically, gas markets are currently set regionally, and there are three major regional markets, the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And what we currently see is there's a really wide divergence with regards to pricing. But actually, looking over the decades in the future, the evolution of new sources of supply, focus on unconventional gas in the US and then in other markets, plus the increased use of liquefied natural gas to increase the flexibility of export destinations, means that markets will become much more integrated and impact more on one another much more quickly. So we'll see a greater integration of how these different regional markets play out, and what happens in one part of the world will be felt much more quickly in other parts of the world.
What about the use of fossil fuels?
Well, we map a couple of different scenarios within the World Energy Outlook, but what we see across all of those scenarios is that fossil fuels will continue to predominate the global energy mix. And actually, in our central scenario, you can still see that even in 2035, fossil fuels play the lion's share of the role in providing our energy supply. But you will see a shift within those fossil fuels. You will see in some markets there'll be a reduction in the use of coal. There will also be but on the other side of things, there'll be an increase in the use of natural gas, which emits much lower CO2 emissions. And alongside this, you'll see globally a much greater increase in the use of renewables worldwide.
Is there already an indication that specifically developed countries are increasingly absorbing renewables?
There absolutely is. Especially you can see developments in Europe, and it's not even just developed countries. You can see that China has already got a lot of renewables, so has Brazil and a number of others. But one of the important things going forward for renewables is that a number of them are still not cost competitive on the marketplace. So for a prolonged period, we expect that a number of governments will continue to need to support the adoption of those renewables if they really want to see them take hold in a big way.
Interesting, because in that regard, you even have figures about, you say in 2011, these subsidies, talking about subsidies to these renewables, amounted to something like $88 billion US, but over the period to 2035, need to amount to $4.8 trillion US. Where does that put us, the developing world? I mean, we don't have that kind of money.
Well, actually, I mean, as you say, looking at 2011, on the one hand, you can say that there are subsidies to renewables of $88 billion, but actually, if you look at the consumption subsidies to fossil fuels in the same year, you can see that the subsidies there were over $520 billion worldwide, a much, much greater sum. So I think you'll see with the commitments that many governments have already made to increase the share of renewables in their energy mix, that the support will continue and will need to continue for a long time to come.
Let me come back here and get some reaction to some of the scenarios that you were talking to me about, Dan. Perhaps I should start with you, Dr. Wakeford. What do you think about these scenarios?
Well, clearly the IEA report has got a wealth of information, and they've really, as the gentleman said, dealing with a very complex set of issues. Underlying any scenarios, you have to make assumptions. And so I think a lot of the discussion about the world energy outlook will drill down to some of the assumptions in terms of the different energy carriers. And there is a lot of debate. Not everybody agrees with some of the assumptions that the IEA is using. Perhaps some of the issues I can just focus on initially are around the kind of issues that the international media have highlighted from the IEA report, and what we've heard so far this morning, and perhaps some of the other things which have been perhaps downplayed internationally. Now, for me, oil is still the most important energy source. I mean, we know that globally, around about a third of world primary energy supply is met by oil. That's the largest share amongst all the different sources of energy. And the oil price is the one resource price which really seems to dominate the international economy. So that's a good place to start. And what's really interesting to me is that in the executive summary of the IEA report, they make a statement there which has got very little media attention, and that is, to quote, output of crude oil, excluding light tight oil, fluctuates between 65 million barrels per day and 69 million barrels per day, never quite reaching the historic peak of 70 million barrels per day in 2008. Now, basically what the IEA is saying there is that conventional oil, which is the kind of oil which is easier and cheaper to extract from the ground, it excludes your Canadian tar sands, your tight oil, or otherwise called shale oil, which they're now producing in the United States and North Dakota and Texas, and various other unconventional oil sources. The conventionals have already peaked. This, to me, should be amongst the highlights that is discussed internationally, because this is a fundamental event. If we look historically, probably over 90%, perhaps even over 95% of the oil that has been produced to date has been conventional oil. And the unconventionals, although the supply is increasing at the moment, has been over the last few years, they do come with some significant limitations and disadvantages. For one thing, they are much more polluting than conventional oil.
Right. Let me come back then to Glenn Holds and say, here South Africa, we're busy dealing with our energy mix. What are the concerns? What should we worry about?
Thanks. I think, for South Africa, this is an interesting global picture, and obviously as a big exporter of coal, these global macro dynamics are going to affect the competitiveness of the South African economy. They're going to affect potentially the input costs of South African export products. But I think that these macro studies don't fully appreciate, I think, some of the real challenges you have in South Africa. at the moment, if you look at Africa as a whole, about 4 out of 5 Africans don't have access to modern forms of energy, particularly electricity, and less than a third of the population of Africa doesn't have access to clean water. So I think some of these statistics, I think belie the huge development challenges that still lie ahead. South Africa has done an amazing job actually in the battle to increase electrification. That was one of the priorities of the RDP program, and has been, a significant commitment of government. But now in the last quartile, let's say, of the population that still does not have access to clean, modern energy, that's going to be a significant challenge. And also, I think it requires looking at different tactics. And that's, I think, where the story of a growing share of renewable energy into the mix globally is very relevant for South Africa. South Africa is just getting started on a massive program to increase the share of renewable energy in the mix. The goal is to have up to 1/3 of the energy mix be from renewable energy sources by 2020 and 50% by 2030. And that's a massive target to be achieved. Not that that's not achievable, but that's going to require dedicated policies and a significant amount of resources, both from the public and the private sector.
There's another interesting dynamic as well in terms of our energy mix, if I may bring you back again, Dan, and that is the issue of nuclear technology, because we are considering it as part of our energy mix. What is the world view on the nuclear technology going forward?
Yeah, I mean, nuclear has seen, obviously there have been a lot of debates around nuclear, basically in light of the accident that happened at Fukushima in Japan. Prior to that accident, there were a number of large-scale programs to increase the role of nuclear in countries' energy mixes. What we've seen after that event is a number of countries, most notably Germany, Switzerland, Japan, and potentially even here in France, are basically contracting the scale which they were planning to have nuclear in their energy mix in the future, so to have a smaller role for nuclear in the future than they previously planned. But actually, when you look globally, while we have revised down our outlook for nuclear this year compared to last year, actually when you look out from now to 2035, we still expect the amount of nuclear capacity in the world energy mix to increase in absolute terms. And actually, this is principally driven by a relatively small number of countries, including China, including Russia, including South Korea, who still have pretty significant plans to include new nuclear within their energy mix in the future. So while there have been very serious events that have changed minds in some countries, actually, when you look at the picture overall, there are still a number of plans for new nuclear going on.